So in today's video, we're gonna be having an ultimate comparison between the brush markers and the regular markers with the point tip and chisel tip. And honestly, I'm the kind of person that usually gravitates towards the brush markers because they are just more convenient and more pleasant to use in my opinion. But I've never actually done a side-by-side comparison between the possibilities that the brush markers give and the possibilities that regular markers without the brush nibs also give. So this is exactly what we're gonna be focusing on today. I'm super curious to find out whether there's gonna be much of a difference between those two types of markers. So I hope you guys are excited to find this out with me as well. And also today's video is sponsored by Bianyo markers. Alright, so let's get into it. So first of all, let's take a look on the visual aspects of the markers. When it comes to the boxes they come in, there's actually no difference. They both come in those quite handy canvas bags. When we compare brush markers to the regular markers, we can tell that the barrel is identical as well. The only difference there is actually the writing on the marker. Brush markers have it clearly visible that they are brush markers on the barrel, while non-brush markers have just some sort of number identification instead. Also, both of the markers have color caps on each end. Now when it comes to the nibs, regular markers have a point tip and a chisel tip. Both of these are quite standard. Brush markers though have a pretty flexible and pointy brush tip on one end and a chisel tip on the other. Now let's compare the color variety for each set. In the regular marker set, we're getting a good variety of shades. We're having some nice skin tone options along with some muted, more pastel shades, and there are actually barely any identical shades, which is something that I appreciate a lot because sometimes it's a problem for big sets that you're getting a lot of repetitive shades. So here's a big plus. For the brush markers color selection, at the first glance, the swatches look pretty similar to the previous set. However, I can tell that this set offers more saturated brown tones. Also comparing these two swatches cards, we can pinpoint a couple of the same shades with the same color codes, so that's also interesting. But overall, not a lot of shades overlaps and repeat, and even though some colors look a bit similar when it comes to those two sets, there are still some differences between them regarding their hue and saturation, which is obviously another plus. Now let's put these markers to the real test. I've prepared those little line arts in a little bit different style than usual because I like to switch it up from time to time, and I'm obviously going to use them for our comparison today. I'm gonna obviously start with the brush markers because this is the type of markers I'm usually gravitating towards. So you guys know that I've used these markers before, so for me it's not like a first impression sort of thing, so I already have some experience working with them, so my thoughts and opinions are gonna be a little bit more thought through, and I do have some experience, so it's gonna be easier for me to give you a full spectrum, a full review. So when it comes to the nib of these brush markers, because that's the most important thing when it comes to brush markers and testing them, I would say that the brush nib is surprisingly amazing actually. It's very flexible, but it's not as flexible to the point that you're missing the details and you're not able to do any precise work. So it has this sort of bouncy feel to it that both allows you to color larger areas, but it also does allow you to go in and color those fine details. So when it comes to the brush nib and quality versus price when it comes to these markers, I would say that, yeah, the brush nib is actually out there and I really like it. And as you guys know, I love using brush nibs for coloring in the skin because that just gives you a lot of possibilities when it comes to layering and blending, because brush nibs usually don't leave any sort of strokes and you can't really tell where you applied an extra layer, so everything is seamless. And in this case, using those markers, it really works like that. So coloring in the skin was just a pleasure for me. I could do a lot of blending, and even though I combined two quite distant colors, So I was really wondering if these are gonna blend well, but with the help of the brush nib and with just the quality overall, the quality of the ink, everything blended quite seamlessly, so I was really happy about that. And when it comes to the layering, as you can tell, there are no problems as well. You can put a lot of layers on top of each other and you won't end up with any streaks and you won't end up with any undesired bleeding. So once more, I'm very surprised with the quality and so far so good. And now when we look once more at the color variety of the brush marker set, one thing I need to point out is that we're not getting any sort of mid skin tones. I mean, we do get some caramel options, but when it comes to the drawing and the color selection that I wanted to go for in this drawing, I didn't get like a peachy sort of saturated tone that I could use to shade in such color, such skin tone that I picked today. So that's just a little minor minus when it comes to the color variety, but other than that, I can tell that, yeah, the color selection is pretty good. I do love the lip color, the quite muted pink. I think that such color will complement perfectly any skin tone out there, and it's a beautiful color in general. So I'm very happy with the color selection. Obviously, if I were to design the color scheme, I would probably do some alternations, but overall, like I said, I'm giving it a good 9 out of 10. And now when it comes to the regular markers, since I'm usually using brush markers, I was a little bit worried if I'm gonna be able to blend the skin properly without having the brush nib, but obviously I took upon this challenge and I just wanted to see how it's gonna go. So I picked the colors that are going to be quite similar to the colors that I used in the previous drawing to compare these two sets the best. And here, actually, when it comes to the regular markers, the no brush markers, the color selection for the skin tones was actually a little bit better, because in this set I did get this sort of mid-tone complexion shade that I was missing in the brush marker set. So I was really happy about that, and you can right away tell that the skin shading, the skin coloring on this drawing is gonna be looking slightly better just due to those two colors and how they combine with each other. Obviously, when it comes to the whole blending situation, since we're not having a brush nib, it's gonna be slightly bit more difficult, but with the quality of the ink that these markers have to offer, I was actually quite surprised that I didn't feel the lack of the brush nib that much, and I could still achieve a really promising and a really good looking and almost seamless blending. You guys gonna see on the close-up comparison later on that the blending is really hard to differentiate in which drawing I used the brush nib and in which I didn't. So I was even surprised myself that it turned out to be this good. So while coloring the skin, I was already surprised that it's going that well. And as most of the times I was actually using the chisel nib because it allowed me to cover larger areas of my drawings. When I was using the point tip for the finer details, it was also quite easy for me to blend everything out and achieve the sort of seamless blending that I'm always going for. So if you're coloring something more detailed, the point tip will also do the work, and it's also pretty good. And also, speaking of the color scheme of those regular markers, I got an impression that these are actually a little bit more saturated. The shades that I chose to be the corresponding shades to my drawing done with the brush nibs, like I said, I got an impression that the shades from the regular markers are slightly more saturated and slightly more vibrant. The difference was quite subtle though, but I think it's still important to bring this up. In general, comparing the coloring process using the brush markers versus the coloring process using the regular markers wasn't that different, even though I was expecting the coloring process without the brush markers to be a little bit more annoying. I can really tell that I enjoyed coloring my drawings with both of the options, and I didn't feel that much of a difference actually. And now let's take a final look on these two drawings and compare them a little bit. As you can tell, the drawing on the left done with the brush markers is slightly more muted and slightly less vibrant, while the drawing done with the regular markers, the drawing on the right, is a little bit more vivid. The colors are brighter and overall it gives you an appearance of just being more vibrant once more. So and overall, I don't think you can tell which drawing was done with brush markers and which one was done with the regular markers if you didn't know the whole process behind it. So I think that says quite a lot about the quality of these markers. So now it's finally the time to let you guys know what do I think and which markers are better. And honestly, I'm having a hard time deciding because as much as I love brush markers, I can't neglect the fact of those regular markers being actually almost as good, if not kind of the same. I mean, yes, brush markers and the brush nib is more comfortable in most of the times because you can easily color in the skin, do the hair and do the finest details, but with this inequality and with this whole experience of the Bianyo markers, I think that you're able to achieve almost identical effects even without having the brush nib. So honestly, the choice is up to you. Everything comes down to your own personal preference and which markers do you actually prefer, if you prefer using the brush nib and working with it, or you're fine with using the point tip and the chisel nib. So yeah, honestly, I can't really tell you which ones are the winners in this sort of comparison. You need to decide yourself, basing your opinion on my whole review, let's say. And yeah, that will be pretty much all for today. If you want to purchase any of the markers, the links are gonna be down in my description box so you can check it out. And thank you guys so much for watching. I love you all and I can't wait to see you in my next videos. Take care, bye!
I'm just going with the gut, never had a doubt, felt like this is just a must. Put me in perspective, I'm the deepest in the cut. Everybody tuning in, but this is just for us now.